Donc maintenant, j'aimerais accueillir le docteur Philippe Calain, qui va nous parler de l'éthique de la donnée, et qui est d'MSF, et qui a une vision très intéressante des actions en termes humanitaires et d'aide médicale, mais particulièrement d'éthique de la donnée. So I'd just like to welcome Dr. Philippe Calain of MSF, who has a very interesting view of medical aid in general, and also of data and geographic information, and more particularly, he's going to speak today about the ethics of data. Thank you.
Madame la Présidente, Madame, chers collègues, je vais commencer en français pour vous remercier d'être invité ici à Chambéry pour vous parler de l'éthique des données géographiques en santé publique. Je vais essayer de vous convaincre, l'éthique n'est pas un sujet aussi rébarbatif qu'il n'y paraît a priori. Je voudrais remercier les organisateurs pour l'honneur qui m'est fait de donner cette première leçon de la journée, et aussi peut-être de manière plus importante pour simplement exister en tant qu'organisation non gouvernementale humanitaire, ce qui me simplifie la vie lorsque je suis amené à vous parler d'éthique. Il y a une certaine ironie à inviter un membre de Médecins sans frontières dans une conférence organisée par ceux qui les définissent. Je veux parler des frontières, mais ce n'est pas un problème éthique essentiel. Je dois souligner avant de commencer que je ne suis ni spécialiste en éthique ni spécialiste en cartographie, mais que le mélange des genres va peut-être amener à quelque chose de positif ou d'intéressant. Et lors de mes recherches préliminaires à cette présentation, je me suis rendu compte que finalement, très peu de choses sont connues ou publiées sur l'éthique de la cartographie. Et nous allons faire un certain chemin ensemble pour découvrir quels sont les problèmes qui seraient posés par ces questions. Je veux aussi dire que depuis que mon collègue Mathieu Soupard de MSF a établi un partenariat avec GeOnG, j'ai le plaisir de recevoir fréquemment la visite de vos collègues. Et depuis lors, je crois que je ne vois plus le monde de la même façon. Et comme vous pouvez le constater, j'ai été amené à changer mon adresse et à l'exprimer de manière différente de mon habitude. Alors, comme je le disais, l'éthique de la cartographie en santé publique est un domaine nouveau et quelque chose qui, j'espère, continuera à être exploré de manière scientifique entre les milieux académiques, les milieux humanitaires et la cartographie. À ce stade, je me rends compte que la langue officielle du Congrès, c'est l'anglais. Je vais donc passer à la suite de ma présentation en anglais. I need to start and to spend about 10 minutes with you to talk about ethics in general, because it's very important to make sure that we speak the same language and that we have the same definition of ethics. And to this effect, I will very briefly tell you what I believe should be understood for ethics. I'm a medical doctor by training, so I have a specific view of ethics, which is called bioethics. And during your interactions with MSF, you will be brought to understand what principles based our deliberations. And of course, the ethics perspective depends on different disciplines. So, as a very short introduction to ethics, I want to submit to you a very critical ethical issue. And this is the statement that Dr. Calain refuses to attend patient A. It could be someone of you who is collapsing during the presentation and who becomes unconscious. And I hope most of you will feel that as something very bad, and some of you might say that this is unethical. By saying that this is unethical, you might think about at least three different issues. This is unethical might mean this has nothing to do with the discipline of ethics. It could be a legal problem, for example. And this could be said by the policeman waiting for me at the exit of this auditorium, ready to arrest me because I didn't attend patient A. So that's one understanding. The second understanding could be that this is simply a statement of feeling, of moral position. Another way to say Dr. Calain is a bad man and he doesn't know what he's expected to do. A third understanding, which is the one we are going to follow the track today, is to try to understand why this is unethical or why this is right or wrong. And actually, in some circumstances, it could be absolutely ethical not to attend patient A. For example, if attending patient A over there would expose me to some snipers or to some danger that outweigh the care of patient A, or simply because patient A has been determined as too advanced to have any hope of treatment. So what I want to say by this example is that there is a common understanding of morality referring to personal opinions of good and bad, right and wrong. We all have opinions about what is right and what is wrong. However, ethics goes beyond that, and ethics, which is a branch of philosophy, it's called moral philosophy, refers to the theoretical reasoning over morality. So in other terms, ethics calls for reasoned debates over right and wrong courses of action. And I want to take you through some reasoning today about what would be right or wrong with cartography. And I should point out that ethics should not be confused with social conventions, like saying this is wrong because everybody else thinks it's wrong. Religious beliefs, which are absolutely okay, but saying this is wrong because God said so is not a matter of ethics. Political opinions or the law. The law has some connection with ethics, but if you think about it, what is legal is not necessarily ethical, and what is unlawful is not necessarily unethical. And I give you some example. I wish we could have some session about the legal issues around mapping. There is at least one country in the world where surveying and mapping are illegal, and this is mainland China. And they even have surveying and mapping law in China, and according to the law, private surveying and mapping activities are illegal. And China's state media have released a news article about illegal mapping efforts as a threat to national security. And they take it very seriously, saying that any foreigner collecting geographical data without permission will be severely punished. Actually, in June this year, a news article from the official China news services exposed the case of a Japanese gentleman who was caught illegally surveying and mapping in a province of China, and he was deported, marking the latest foreigner involved in such misconduct in China, I quote. And the Japanese individual is accused to disguise himself as a tourist, and an official of the military National Defense University said that, speaking about foreigners coming to map in China, that their mapping is for military purposes in most cases. If you ask me if the behavior of this Japanese gentleman is ethical or not, I have no idea. It might be not. But just to point out that legal issues have not much to do with ethical issues. So my first conclusion in this prologue is that the primary purpose of ethics is not to sanction misconduct, and instead ethics is about understanding reasons, values, and choices. Now, the second point I want to make as an introduction is to show you that as health workers, we have some principles of ethical deliberations. You probably the first thing that would come to your mind first would be the Hippocratic oath, but this is a rather old-fashioned, and there is new or more modern ways of reasoning. And to tell you what are the modern principles of bioethics, I want to tell you a story. A colleague of mine, whose name is Dr. Marduk, is an infamous clinician, and he has a hobby. He's conducting private research in his spare time. And Marduk has isolated a new substance called substance S that produces convulsions in rats, and he's curious to test it in humans. One of his patients, called Ashur, is serving prison time in an antique facility, and you have the coordinates here because that's what you are interested in. Actually, this is the coordinates of Nineveh ruins in Iraq. And Dr. Marduk finds it convenient to test substance S on Ashur, claiming that S is a new drug that will improve Ashur's depression. Of course, he doesn't believe that for 1 minute. I hope very much, I don't see anybody standing and leaving the room, but I hope very much that you feel outraged by reading or hearing from this story. And I must say that Marduk is not my friend. But if we speak about ethics beyond just the sense of moral outrage, we need to think why this is unethical. And I don't have time to have a debate with you about why this is unethical, but probably you would agree with me that this is unethical because testing substance has absolutely no benefit for Ashur. It's dangerous. It's disrespectful to treat a human being in this way, especially without consent. And Dr. Marduk is taking advantage of Ashur being a prisoner to make this horrible experiment with impunity. And this is better expressed by summarizing the 4 common principles of biomedical ethics as autonomy, which is practically respect for patient's choice, telling the truth, seeking consent, privacy, and respecting confidentiality. Beneficence, you need to seek the patient's benefits first. Non-maleficence, do not harm. Both things are different. You can give just saline to Ashur, which will do not harm, but this is not of any benefit. And of course, justice, and I mean not distributional justice. That means treating people fairly. So that's the ways ethics are seen from a biomedical perspective, and the way I want you to confront the ethics of cartography, especially in times of public health emergencies. And finally, what I want to say about ethics is that the perspectives depends on professional disciplines. I just talked about biomedical ethics, bioethics. If I'm in this situation as a doctor or as a nurse, that is the yard of a hospital in Port-au-Prince just after the earthquake of 2010, I will have to make choices. And those choices are called clinical triage. And if I choose not to attend one of these patients because I think the case is beyond what I could do surgically, I don't necessarily apply the same biomedical ethics as I would do in normal circumstances. So humanitarian ethics has its own features and its own problems. And the same for the ethics of photojournalism, and I've been interested for years in ethics of photojournalism to the extent that they interfere with classical humanitarianism. You see a lot of displays of sick or distressed people from humanitarian NGOs, and this is normal and good, but it creates ethical issues. And the ethics of cartography, to the extent that such a discipline exists, pose specific problems also. So let's examine what could be the ethics of cartography. When I did some research in preparation to this presentation, I didn't find very much in terms of publications in the scientific literature. I found mostly two types of concerns. The first concern is the accuracy of data. For example, if you are deployed in a country and you publish a map and you fail to indicate a high-rise tower, and the next day a plane crashes in this tower, you might be taken as responsible for having put this element on the map. But that's not really an ethical issue. The other issue that is classically reported, and I quote a paper by Mr. Harley in Cartography, and I assume that the magazine Cartography is one that all of you read first thing in the morning before your breakfast. He mentioned some social cultural issues, and I take some illustration from Mr. Harley's paper. The issues are derogatory names that define specific places, and here is a list in the United States. There are places that used to be called Negro Tank, Nigger Canyon, Nigger Jackslow, Negro Rube Creek, etc. It seems that they've changed the name, and this is good. Another list of examples from with Amerindians. I took the examples of mapping white gypsies or Irish travelers in a ward called Highbury East in London. And if I want to open my shop of gypsy food, I would probably go in the right part of this area. So you would say it doesn't harm. I'm not sure if I were a gypsy or an Irish traveler in the UK if I would like to be mapped in this way, but this is not too dramatic. I give you a more disturbing example. In the United States, some groups concerned with security have managed to get a map of criminal alien releases by zip code. So criminal aliens released from jail go back to their home, of course, and there are ways to know exactly where they are living. And this is for the reasons that if you want to check your backyard for murder convicts released by the Department of Health Services, we have got a map for that, which is, of course, very questionable. So those are a few examples of ethical issues raised by mapping demographic, social, and even health features. And another example that fascinates me is the problem of verticality. We used to see map in a horizontal display, but if we had to map the cases of an outbreak in a city like Seattle, and this is a place where most of the housings are skyscrapers, how would you map exactly in the vertical dimensions? And of course the answer is simple, and I think you will have a session on that. You will use drones, or as I read in your program, you would use balloons. And the use of drones for mapping is not without its own problems. In June this year, a lady called Mrs. Plyce, living in Seattle on the 26th floor of a skyscraper, had the surprise to see a drone flying in front of her apartment, and she felt very distressed. Actually, she felt violated. The same report from tabloid newspaper said she was naked in her apartment. Can you imagine? And why would a drone fly on the 26th floor of such an apartment? Well, actually, the person who activated the drone came forward to say that he's the owner of a small business from Portland, Oregon, and he told the lady that his crew was taking photographs of the area for a building that they are developing 20 minutes east of Mrs. Plyce's apartment. So this is for real estate development. And of course, I know that the drones are being used successfully for the reconstruction of Haiti. And I know, of course, that those drones are used for horizontal mapping. But when would you go to vertical mapping, and what type of picture would you use to define social, demographic, or health features? And of course, you would probably use photographs as well. And what I want to point out is that the use of remote sensing, for example, satellite imaging, is not any different from common photographs, to the extent that you can take pictures of people or community from a safe distance if you are, and even if you are not concerned with ethical issues, without asking the consent. And as an illustration, I want to show you this picture, which I shouldn't show you because I find it absolutely unethical. This is photographs taken at high magnification of people belonging to a tribe that does not want to be seen. Actually, they have refused to make contact with what we call civilization. And the paradox is that the picture was taken by a person belonging to Survival International. So they believe that the survival of those people goes through showing them in picture. And the caption says, Diego Cortijo used a zoom lens to photograph these members of the Mascopiro tribe in Peru. And according to Survival International, this is the closest they have ever been seen. Of course, this is not for public health cartography, but this is claimed to be used for humanitarian purpose, the preservation of this Peruvian tribe. Now, when we examine the ethics of public health mappings, we should weight the possible harms of the type I've just shown with the benefits. And I sincerely believe that the benefits outweigh much of the harms. Mapping for public health purposes carries important benefits for individuals and communities, and think about all you can do with your mapping tools. You can draw base maps, inform humanitarian response with demographic data, show the incidence of the distribution of disease incidence. You could also map the risks to draw predictive models, and of course research. And I'm a researcher, and I like very much the idea of using maps for research. As an example of progress with base maps, this is a map drawn in 1976 by Dr. Peter Pio during the very first Ebola outbreak. And of course, you know Peter Pio, who was he was an eminent virologist, now Dean of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And let's compare this with a map of Macenta, which is one of the places where the current Ebola outbreak was started, and no doubt that there is much progress with that. And of course, it is one of the essential features of descriptive epidemiology, and in particular outbreak investigations, to use maps, because you can do epidemiology only by collecting information on the cases, using a case definition, the time, the place, the persons, and the cause. You cannot do epidemiology without all those informations. And this goes back to the first serious attempts at mapping diseases, and you all probably know the story of Dr. John Snow, who at the time was interested in a cholera outbreak in London. He didn't know the germ theories, he didn't know that it was due to Vibrio cholera, but he managed by mapping to establish the cause of the outbreak as contamination of water in some wells of London. And the famous experiment is well known. Having realized where the contaminated water came from, he removed the handle of the water pumps, and allegedly the outbreak was terminated in this way. So this is very important. My claim and my main claim to try to approach ethical issues is that mapping data are not any different from other epidemiological data, being the temporal magnitude of the outbreak, biological sampling, even sequencing, environmental sampling, and as on the right lower corner, which is the mapping of diarrhea cases in France during an outbreak situation. So all those things are necessary to progress with diseases. So mapping is part of public health response, and mapping has huge benefits. However, in the same way as you could see clearly gypsy people in their location in London, or Mrs. Plyce seen by a drone, if you are not careful with map, you could easily identify communities and even individuals. And talking with colleagues of GeOnG, I realized that you are actually extremely careful about that. And the red dots on this map showing the new cases of Ebola virus show clusters of cases which could be disaggregated at higher definition to show exactly the housing of the people, but you don't do that exactly. And I think that is one ethical way to approach that, and the other way is to restrict access to such data, and we will see that later. This is a similar map showing not the cases, but the contacts of the cases. And you see highlighted in red hazes some places where there is some security problems. So just imagine if such maps were in the hands of people who have rather hard-handed approach to outbreak control and who would arrest those people who don't comply with public health measures. This is the case actually in Freetown in Sierra Leone these days, and this is highly disputable. So just to show you another example of why mapping data might potentially breach anonymity of people. These are two versions of the same spreadsheet, epidemiological spreadsheet. On the upper one, you see 2 cases of a disease that by now, after 30 minutes of talk, you are becoming familiar with. It's called dementia, medical dementia syndrome. And you see 2 patients, Calain and Marduk. And of course, you have seeing their addresses, you can easily find out who they are, where they are, and bring some stigmatization to them. And the right way to do that in classical epidemiology is to anonymize the name and replace it by an identification number. However, if you give the location, and for myself I gave the location of the MSF office in Geneva, there is apparently only one medical doctor, 57 years old. So I become identified by the mere display of geographical locations. So my first conclusions is to say that from an ethics perspective, GIS data collected for public health purposes are not different from other public health data. Depending on uses and purposes, mapping people's features can have benefits but also cause harms. And this is part of the ethical process to be aware of what kind of benefits but also what kind of harms. And data collection and uses should be respectful of dignity, privacy, and confidentiality, provide benefits and minimize harms. This is all nice but a bit theoretical, isn't it? So let's see in practice what kind of harms you could think about. And one obvious harm, of course, would be problems with the security of people if they are, for example, threatened to be arrested if their location and identification is known. But there are more subtle harms to think about. And referring to a very a useful and recent framework published by Health Canada, I would like to draw your attention on two types of harms that are easily overseen: harms to project participants and harms to trust relationships. So harms to project participants, which are not directly threatening their physical security, is that the collection or disclosure of information may lead to psychological distress, discrimination, stigmatization, or economic loss of individuals or communities. And project might also cause what ethicists call dignitary harm. That means failing to show respect for individuals or communities, even when no consequential harm or injury has occurred. So the mere fact that I go to your place and I start to take pictures, or I start to take geographical coordinates, even if it doesn't cause harm to me, is a dignitary harm if I'm not aware of what's going on, or if I'm not asked consent to do that. And the second type of harm, which is even more serious, is harms to trust relationships. And in some cases, public health projects may lead to loss of trust in public health service providers, with negative consequences extending beyond the project in question. We have a very famous case that is often quoted as being a threat to the success of the polio eradication campaign. And this is the case of Dr. Afridi, Pakistani official, public health official, who was recruited by the CIA to try to help confirm the presence of Osama bin Laden in his compound in Abbottabad. I don't know if he brought a GIS device with him, but the end result is that the exact location of the compound was known with the help of a public health investigation. Actually, he presented to the compound as an officer wishing to vaccinate the family against hepatitis, actually. We need to make the difference in terms of ethical reasoning, because the collection of data, the sharing of data, and the publication of data. And for that, I can refer you to some authoritative publications. In terms of data sharing, there is ethical imperative to share the data during public health emergencies. And again, I show you the terms of the calculus, arguments against data sharing. People, you and me, or some companies spending time, resources to research, to collect the data. So there are some issues of competitive approach. And moral arguments in times of public health emergency, which is arguments of reciprocity and solidarity. In other terms, we cannot put forward issues of private benefits in cases of public health emergency. We need to display solidarity. So data sharing is not only constitutive of good scientific practice, but it is the morally sound default position in public health emergencies. In terms of publications, there are some, again from the same source, there are some well-defined ethical arguments explaining when consent may be waived, and in particular the use of personally not identifiable materials, the use of personally identifiable materials with special justification, whatever it means, or studies performed within the scope of regulatory authorities. So if the public health authorities oblige you legally to share the data, you need to do it for the greater good, and other cases. So approaching to the final conclusion, I want to go back to the issue of data collection and consent to do so. As I said, the GIS, like the photography technology, makes it technically feasible for you to collect public health data without individual consent. However, you will not do so whenever possible. What I wrote in one of your publications is that the argument not to publish the data is based on the fact that data are sensitive or not. And I would suggest that you replace sensitive, or you add to sensitive harmful. Because when you say that some data are sensitive, this is the perspective of the organization. You don't want to create distrust or to compromise the trust in your organization, which is a very different approach from asking what harm the collection of those data would cause to individuals. So sensitive and harmful are two important arguments. And when individual consent is not warranted, feasible, or appropriate, as I believe it is now in many places during the Ebola response, surveyors, cartographers, and users need to be aware of the burdens and risks of individuals and communities surveyed and act accordingly. And what does it mean, act accordingly? I would suggest that means to be open towards community about the purpose, benefits, and burdens of GIS data collection and sharing. In other terms, you will not do that in clandestinity. And to minimize burdens and risk. And I learned that this is what you are already doing. You should strive to collect only as much information necessary to achieve the survey objective, not more. There is a tendency with epidemiologists to say, let's get as many data as possible. We will see later what we can do with that. This is not correct. Collecting non-identifying information where possible. That means, in your case, disaggregate clusters to the strict minimum needed. Limiting the data fields. If you need disaggregation by sex, by age, by ethnicity, if it's really necessary, you do it. But if it's not necessary, you should limit those data fields. And employing appropriate security measures for the protection of privacy and confidentiality. So this is what I wanted to tell you very quickly. I realize this is very little compared to the magnitude and the number of issues that you might face in the field. What is good with GIS is that it gives you the feeling of being the center of the universe. And today in Chambéry, we are at the center of this universe. Thank you very much.
So if you have any questions for Dr. Calain, it's possible to have one or two. We're running late already on the timetable, so we'll just take two, but go ahead, don't hesitate.
Je suis désolé, je vais la faire en français. Le souci, alors moi je suis cartographe OSM, et le souci qu'on a par rapport à l'éthique des données, c'est un exemple simple, c'est les banques. Est-ce qu'on doit mettre les banques sur la carte ou pas? Parce que si les banques sont sur la carte, les voleurs pourront les attaquer. Et en fait, ce à quoi on est arrivé, c'est que c'est pas tant la donnée collectée qui est un problème que l'usage qu'on va en faire et la réutilisation. Et c'est un des points qui est opposé à la volonté de libération de la donnée, c'est que si on libère la donnée trop, n'importe qui pourra faire n'importe quoi avec, surtout pas ce pourquoi la donnée a été faite au départ. Typiquement, les collectes de données médicales liées à des surveys, pour un sujet au départ, si elles sont libérées, même anonymisées, elles pourraient être utilisées d'une manière dont on n'a pas idée par quelqu'un d'autre. Et ça, malheureusement, ça pourrait aider les gens qui ne veulent pas partager la donnée. Et moi, j'aime bien partager la donnée.
Merci de cet exemple. C'est un. Maybe I reply. Or the question was, should we put the place of the banks in the on the maps, taking the risk that the maps would be identified by people who wants to rob the banks and put people at risk. And I think it's a very good metaphor of what's going on. There are two different approaches to that. There is a legal approach that would say we forbid to map the banks, which will not be satisfactory. But some national legislation could say it's forbidden to map the airports or to map the military facilities. Ethicists would approach the problem differently and ask at least two questions. And they would ask, first, have you been aware of the consequences of putting the banks on the map? And obviously you are aware, and that's not always the case. The second question would be, is it really necessary to put the banks on the maps to achieve your objectives? I'm not sure that in terms of public health, banks have any interest. For retail, for access to economic profits, banks might be useful, but that's a weak ethical approach. So do we need to put the banks on the maps? What are the consequences of doing so? And if yes, we need to put the banks on the map and we are aware of the consequences, the third question is how shall we minimize the access or the understanding of, for example, how much cash is inside of the bank? So the ethics approach would not say it's forbidden to put the banks on the map, but start to ask yourself 2 or 3 questions before that.
We have a last question. Sorry, oh yeah, the mic is coming.
Thank you. Excuse me. I just wanted to add on to that because I think that's an excellent example of what we're dealing with today in geographic data is that location of things has always been known. You know where the bank is. You can find a paper map and you can draw it on there. So it's not a question of should we map things. It's how do we understand in a modern technological framework how that can be used differently. So we always knew where the banks are. We always a thief could always go by and put it on a map and plan something. So it's, and I mean, this is not about humanitarian data, but it's just about data and the modern technological space that we're in. So if we have the ability to get data quicker and can do things with that data more quickly, it poses, it's not an answer, it just poses a different ethical question. Not of should we or shouldn't we, but what are the risks of that? They're not the risks of someone knows the bank's there and they can steal from it. It's that people are able to do things with data quicker and more efficiently than we could before. So it opens up a whole different realm of conversation. So I think that's a really, really interesting point that lends itself to a lot of what we will be talking about.
Yeah, I think it was more a comment and a support to the use of this metaphor. I would add that maps should be put in their context, and maps cannot be used in the absence of other information. In other terms, if you know the exact location of my office and the exact location of my desk, it doesn't make necessarily me exposed to stigma or to any harm. It goes with the collection of data for a specific disease, for example. So it's the aggregation of different streams of data that makes people identifiable and ultimately at risk. So this is part of the ethical calculus. What is the context of the mapping? And I'm totally aware that nowadays with the technology and the sharing of data is very difficult to, and even inappropriate to control the extent and precision of mapping. But putting it into context might be part of the solution. And it's not easy, and ethics questions are not easy and don't give yes or no answers, contrary to the law.
So thank you very much for this very enlightening talk. We can perhaps continue it over coffee. So please meet us here again in 15 minutes for the plenary session with René Saméli from ICRC, with Paul Spiegel from the UNHCR, and Paolo De Silva from ESRI. So at 1:15. Thank you very much.